By the early 1700s, Spain had been ruling the Americas for over 200 years. Think of the empire as a giant machine that ran on silver. Silver from Potosi in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico fueled Spain's global wars, paid for its bureaucracy, and even reached China through trade, making Spain part of a first truly global economy. But there was a problem. By 1700, Spain was financially strained and administratively fragmented. In November 1700, the last Habsburg king, Charles II, died childless, sparking the War of Spanish Succession. When the conflict ended, the Spanish crown passed to the House of Bourbon, originally from France. This is why they're called the Bourbon Reforms. These were the 18th century policies of this new Bourbon dynasty, beginning with King Philip V, the first Bourbon monarch of Spain. The Bourbons looked around and saw that Spain's empire was inefficient, corrupt, and falling behind rivals like Britain and France. Smuggling flourished in nearly every port, taxes were outdated, and colonial elites or criollos exercised substantial local influence. Colonial documents used the term criollo to refer to a person of full Spanish ancestry born in the Americas. Criollos dominated local society and economy but were barred from the highest offices, which were reserved for peninsulares or Spaniards born in Spain. Older historians once described what followed simply as a rational modernization program, an attempt to fix a decaying Habsburg empire. But more recent scholarship, however, sees the Bourbon reforms as part of a broader 18th century transformation. Spain was becoming what historians call a fiscal military state, restructuring its empire to compete with Britain and France in an age of nearly constant warfare. The Bourbons launched sweeping reforms in the 18th century, beginning with Philip V and Ferdinand VI, but the colonial reorganization reached its fullest expression under Charles III of Spain. Historians debate how coordinated the Bourbon reforms really were. Some see them as a coherent imperial blueprint. Others argue that they were improvised responses to fiscal crises and military defeats, implemented unevenly across regions. So the goal was to enhance royal authority, increase tax collection, strengthen military defenses, and reduce the power of intermediary institutions, including the church. Ironically, the long-term effect was destabilizing. By integrating the colonies more tightly into Spain's fiscal and military system, the Bourbons also increased colonial exposure to European wars and metropolitan crises. Let's examine the Bourbon reforms in detail. Administrative reforms. In the area of colonial administration, Spain established two new viceroyalties: the Viceroyalty of New Granada, with its capital in Santa Fe or modern-day Bogota, and the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, with its capital in Buenos Aires. The Viceroyalty of New Granada was re-established in 1739 with authority over Panama, Ecuador, Colombia, and parts of Venezuela. Venezuela and Chile became separate captaincies general, and in 1776 Spain established the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, which included Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, as well as the silver mines in Upper Peru or modern-day Bolivia. This restructuring reduced the territorial dominance of Peru and redistributed fiscal power. Historians increasingly interpret this move not merely as administrative efficiency, but as a deliberate strategy to prevent regional concentrations of wealth and authority. Spain also restructured the audiencias or judicial tribunals in Spanish America. Their number was expanded and peninsulares were appointed as judges. Earlier, under the Habsburgs, several criollos had obtained positions in the audiencias, either by purchasing these public offices or through family connections. Now, the Bourbon minister of the Indies, José de Galvez, curtailed the practice of the sale of audiencia offices. Now, judges were increasingly appointed directly from Spain, and they were well paid to prevent them from developing economic ties to local criollos. When the new audiencias were established at Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Cusco, only 2 criollos were selected out of 34 appointments of judges. Beginning in 1764, Spain sent Spanish officials known as intendants to supervise fiscal administration and implement the Bourbon reforms at the municipal level. The intendants were efficient tax collectors operating out of major provincial towns. They replaced the old cabildos or town councils and corregidores. Scholars today often interpret the intendant system as an example of bureaucratic rationalization, an early form of modern state surveillance designed to standardize extraction across diverse colonial societies. The Bourbons also tried to end repartimiento by introducing a law in 1747 that stipulated that indigenous people pay all tribute in cash by attempting to push them all into the money economy. This reform merely acknowledged what was already becoming a fact. The labor system in the colonies was shifting towards free wage, and forced labor drafts were no longer effective. Although in some places like San Salvador, the indigo farmers continued to rely upon labor drafts. Trade reforms. Commercial deregulation formed the capstone of the Bourbon reforms. In a series of measures, the Bourbons deregulated colonial trade to expand commerce between Spain and American ports. The economic results of the so-called free trade reforms were dramatic. Spanish trade with its American colonies increased dramatically, in some areas by 300%. Here, historians disagree. Some emphasize that this commercial growth benefited many colonial merchants and stimulated economic expansion. Others argue that deregulation primarily strengthened peninsular networks and deepened colonial dependency within a Spanish imperial framework. To stimulate mining, the crown reduced mercury prices, lowered certain taxes, and established the Royal Mining College in Mexico City. Silver production in New Spain rose significantly in the late 18th century. Economic historians often view this as a success story of state-led development, but one that redistributed wealth upward toward imperial fiscal structures. Tax reforms. The crown updated taxes to ensure Madrid got a bigger slice of colonial wealth. Tax policies were designed to stimulate the economy. The sales tax or alcabala was raised, and indigenous tribute collections became stricter. Mining equipment became exempt from sales tax. Mining taxes were reduced from 20% to 10% of production. Again, tax reductions were meant to boost production. The tax collectors simultaneously closed tax loopholes and reduced tax evasion that had always been a feature of mining in the Americas. In New Spain, crown revenue nearly tripled between 1760 and 1800, yet rising revenue did not equal stability. Spain's imperial obligations, especially defense, expanded simultaneously. By 1810, the colonial governments in Spanish America were approaching the state of financial collapse. Historians working in the fiscal military tradition argue that the Bourbon monarchy became trapped in a paradox. Reform generated more revenue, but war generated even greater expenditures. Royal monopolies over tobacco, salt, gunpowder, and spirits increased state income. The tobacco factory in Mexico City employed thousands under regulated conditions. The tobacco factory in Mexico City employed approximately 9,000 workers, many of them women and children. They worked a 12-hour shift, Monday through Saturday, except for religious holidays. A workers' cofradia provided burial insurance and other benefits, and there was even a kind of on-site daycare for young children. Social historians note that while monopolies disrupted small producers, they also created new wage labor communities. These reforms were therefore both extractive and transformative. Military reforms. After the 7 Years' War exposed Spain's vulnerability, fortifications were expanded and militias organized across the empire. They built new fortifications in Havana, Veracruz, and San Juan, and created local militias, sometimes including criollos, to defend the empire from Britain, especially after humiliating losses during the 7 Years' War. Free men of color frequently filled militia ranks. Some rose to officer positions and sought military fueros or special privileges associated with military service, such as tax exemptions and protections from civil legal actions. The Bourbon reformers distrusted the new social status of some of the castas and worried that they would not be up to the task of defending the colonies from British and French military power in the Americas. So starting in 1760, new militias were created everywhere in the colonies, paid for by the colonists themselves. Earlier historiography treated these militias as simply defensive, but more recent scholarship emphasizes their unintended consequences. By professionalizing colonial military structures, the Bourbons inadvertently trained future insurgent leadership. Church reforms. The political power and wealth of the church had grown steadily from its humble missionary origins in the 16th century. From the perspective of the Bourbon kings, the church enjoyed far too tight a hold on people's loyalties, and its extensive property represented a threat to the king. In 1767, the Bourbons expelled the Society of Jesus from the Americas. The Jesuits had been deeply involved in education, science, and indigenous missions, and they owned some of the most productive estates in the colonies. Some merchant groups might have applauded the humbling of the powerful Jesuits, but their sudden removal left many communities shaken. Criollo elites who had been educated by Jesuits saw the expulsion as an attack on their cultural world. Of the 680 Jesuits who were exiled from Mexico, 450 were criollos. 58% of the 160 Jesuits in Chile were criollo. Older interpretations saw this as anti-clerical reform inspired by the Enlightenment, but contemporary historians stress its political dimensions. The expulsion of the Jesuits weakened the transatlantic intellectual networks that had linked criollo elites to a broader Catholic scholarly world. Jesuit agricultural estates, schools, and other properties were confiscated and redistributed. One of the largest Jesuit estates in Uruguay, for example, was the Estancias de las Vacas. That was taken over by the lay brotherhood of the wealthy Spanish merchants in Buenos Aires. The Hermandad de Santa Caridad sent out professional administrators and extra workers to the estate. The cattle herds proliferated, cattle hides were sold for export, and wheat and dried meat were brought to Buenos Aires to support orphanages and girls' schools that the Brotherhood managed. The Bourbon reforms also reduced the rights and privileges of the secular clergy, the thousands of parish priests throughout the towns and villages in the Americas. They had always enjoyed a special fuero or immunity from civil courts. Its elimination angered the parish priests, and a few of them would later become important leaders of the rebellion, particularly in Mexico. Spain's attack on church power also served as an offensive on indigenous village autonomy. Decline of the missionary orders, especially in Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, and Peru, removed their protection of peasant villages. The Bourbons initiated a campaign against the treasuries of the cofradías or the sodalities of indigenous communities. These represented the savings funds of indigenous communities that financed local religious rites and fiestas. Now, some of these sodalities were quite prosperous, such as those belonged to the villages that had held indigo lands in El Salvador. Recent indigenous-centered scholarship argues that Bourbon reforms undermine long-standing village autonomy and fiscal protections. And in this interpretation, rebellions were not merely tax revolts, but defenses of communal sovereignty. Rebellions. The uprisings led by Tupac Amaru II nearly destabilized colonial Peru. The Comunero Revolt protested fiscal burdens. For much of the 20th century, historians interpreted these revolts as precursors to independence. Today, many scholars argue they were not nationalist movements, but complex regional uprisings with varied social agendas, some even invoking loyalty to the king against corrupt officials. The crisis of 1808. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, and King Ferdinand VII of Spain abdicated, and Joseph Bonaparte was installed. Earlier nationalist narratives treated independence as inevitable, the culmination of long resentment. But modern scholarship rejects that teleology. Instead, historians emphasize contingency. The crisis of 1808 produced a constitutional vacuum. If sovereignty resided in the monarch and the monarch was absent, did sovereignty revert to the people? Juntas formed across Spain and the Americas. Initially loyal to Ferdinand VII, they became labs of political experimentation. Independence was not preordained. It emerged from debates over legitimacy, representation, and authority within a collapsing imperial system. Within barely a decade, Spain's American empire unraveled. Mexico declared independence in 1821. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led revolutionary movements across South America. Spain had attempted to build a stronger, more centralized empire, but in doing so, it created new fiscal pressures, new military actors, and new political expectations. Reform did not mechanically cause independence, but it reshaped the imperial system in ways that made rupture possible when crisis came. Thanks for watching. See you next time.